I would like to talk now about sound production on the flute, which is probably one of the greatest mysteries of the instrument and also one of the most important things that we can master as flutists, because it is, after all, the beautiful sound which the listener hears first and which makes the biggest impression. Now, I have studied sound and flute with some of the greatest teachers in the world. I'm very fortunate, and I've taken bits and pieces that I've learned from all of my teachers, and this is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. The main concept behind sound production, in my opinion, is having the proper angle of air hitting the instrument and vibrating and resonating throughout this tube. So there are several key elements that have to be in place. The first one is you have to have the flute placed quite low on your chin, much lower than most players ever imagine. There's this concept that the flute is played on the lip. That's not actually true. The flute rests on the chin, really in the little scoop right here beneath the lips, in the chin, so that the lip can be free to move and be flexible during playing. If the flute is crushing the lower lip, then you don't have any flexibility. You also will have an incorrect angle of airstream into the instrument and you will be out of tune. So place the flute much lower on your chin than you're probably used to. At first, it will feel very strange. My students always tell me that it feels like the flute is falling off their face, but trust me, it will work. The next key that you need is, now that your flute is lower on your chin, you need to angle down into the instrument more than you were when the flute was higher. So you need to bring the angle of the air into the embouchure hole of the instrument itself, much more than you were when you had it up here on your lip. The other key element is that now that the flute has been dropped down so much, you need to roll the flute out, away from you. Now, I do not mean to say that you just turn it here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about using your hands to roll the flute forward. Because if you don't do that, and you put the flute in the same position that you had it when it was higher on your lip, and you drop it lower, you'll find now that you're covering too much of this hole, that there's no opening here for the air to go into. So as a consequence of putting the flute lower on your chin, you need to roll it out. Then, in this position, you start angling the air into the tube of the flute. Now, one thing to keep in mind is it's very important that air hit the instrument, because sound waves are created by the air hitting an actual physical body, which in this case is our flute. It's the metal, the silver or the gold of the flute itself. Sound is not produced by air blowing around out here in the wind, in the air before us. So if you're blowing all of your air out here, there's no sound being produced. The sound waves occur when it hits metal. So you need your air to hit metal in order to produce a sound. The goal is to get the most resonant sound possible, to keep the entire tube of the flute resonating and vibrating and filled with sound. If you're only resonating this much of the flute, you're not maximizing the capabilities of its sound production. You need to get the entire tube vibrating with that sound. Now, to do that, there are one of two ways of thinking about it, and it really depends on the individual player. Some of my students work better when I tell them to angle it one way, some students the other, depending on their uniqueness of their own embouchure. But I very rarely tell my students to angle the air directly down into the tube, because then you're only really maximizing the resonance of this much of the instrument. Instead, I tell my students to experiment and first try angling the air a little bit to their left, so that it hits the crown of the flute and hits it with a good force and energy, so that it bounces off the crown of the flute and shoots down the tube the other direction, all the way out the end of the flute. And even, I sometimes say, burn a hole in the wall that's on the opposite end of this flute. So you can bounce the air with a slight angle this way into the crown and down. In some cases, students have a better result when they just think of angling the air down the end of the tube this way. So experiment with both ways. This is how you start, because I know I've given you a lot of information there very quickly, and this is not something that will happen or change overnight. It will take some time. So let's start with just the head joint. Even if you're not a beginner, it's helpful sometimes to go back especially when you're trying something new with your sound. Just go back to the head joint. Rest your fingers gently here, because what I want you to feel is when you play with a good, strong, solid tone, that the entire tube here is vibrating under your fingers. Place the flute lower on your chin. Roll it out, away from you. And then use a strong, solid, energized bursts of air that you sustain to resonate the entire tube of the instrument. It's probably hurting your ears. Now, I want you to play that and sustain that tone until you're dizzy, because that's how much energy and air you need to play the flute when it's all put together. If you're not blowing your brains out when you're playing with just this, then you're not going to increase your capacity for sound production when you put the whole flute together. Etc. Then you'll put your flute together. Also, what I just did was I'm lining up my instrument. I always make sure that my embouchure hole is lined up with the first key. If anything, it's a little bit turned out, but in line with this key, or turned out a little bit, but never turned in. Then play an A with the same sound and energy that you played when it was just the head joint. And again, lower on the chin, roll out, and angle the air either to the crown of the flute or down the end of the tube. And if you have an open hole flute, you need to be feeling vibrations under your fingers, especially if you're playing like a D or something where you're closed on all these notes here, because you should be putting that much energy into the tube of the instrument. Etc. Those are the key elements to a good sound production, to getting the right angle of air. Now, you have to build up strength over time playing this, and once you have the angle all set where you want it, it's a good time to start working on the vibrato exercise, which I discussed in a different video, and to play that also with a full, strong, resonating tone through the instrument. So if you work on that, it will feel very strange at first, but I guarantee you over time you will like the result.